I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after another wave of intense Russian bombardments, we explore what the new Gaza ceasefire could mean for the war. Will it bring renewed international attention or further distraction? Plus, we deliver our latest fortnightly update on resistance inside the occupied territories and ask, how strong is America's commitment to Europe's defence now? With insights from one of the US Army's former top generals.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 10th of October, 3 years and 230 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, Dr. Jade McGlynn of the War Studies Department of King's College London, and later, former Commanding General of United States Army Europe, Ben Hodges. But first, over to Dom for the latest in the military sphere.
So let's start inside Ukraine. In the early hours of this morning, Russia launched a massive attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, triggered power outages in much of Kyiv and beyond. 2 people died in the city, including a child, and at least 10 others injured as Moscow bombarded the capital and several other regions across Ukraine with a barrage of drones, bombs and missiles. Across the country as a whole, 6 people have been killed and 50 injured in the last 24 hours. Vitaly Klitschko, Kyiv's mayor, said the left bank of Kyiv had lost power and there have been disruptions to water supplies in the area. In a post on Telegram, he said, due to a massive attack by enemy UAVs, so uninhabited air vehicles, drones, there may be disruptions in electricity and water supply in the capital. All services are working, monitoring the situation and ready to respond. So if we look across Kyiv, for those who know the city, in the Pechersky district, that's it right in the centre of the city, emergency services extinguished a fire in a residential building caused by falling drone debris. That comes from Mr. Klitschko. He said several floors had caught fire before the blaze was brought under control. Then in the Holosivsky district, that's to the south, another residential building was damaged and nearby cars caught fire. And in the Desnyansky district, that's to the northeast, debris from a downed Russian missile landed near a medical clinic, according to reports there. So just after 2:40 in the morning, Kyiv City Military Administration head Timur Tkachenko said from the explosions that just occurred, a ballistic missile attack is ongoing. Missiles one after another. Air defence is active. Now, DTEK, the energy company, said its specialists are working to restore power supply, prioritising critical infrastructure facilities. Equipment at one of the company's thermal power plants was damaged, they said, and in a statement on Twitter, DTEK said, this is the 3rd strike on our facilities in 1 week. Since February 2022, our thermal power stations have been hit over 200 times. Our engineers are restoring damaged equipment. Longer term, we are accelerating construction of decentralised renewable energy sites that are harder to hit and faster to repair. They said, we call on Ukraine's allies to urgently increase air defence supplies. Now, emergency power restrictions have been introduced elsewhere in Kyiv Oblast, as well as in the Poltava, Sumy, Donetsk, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv Oblast. That's basically from the north through the northeast to the east. That's just strikes on power facilities. There were obviously, as I said, strikes elsewhere across the country. Nearly 30,000 households have been left without electricity in the Brovary and Boryspil districts of Kyiv Oblast. That's to the northeast and southeast edges of the capital city. And several apartment buildings and shops were damaged in the regions there. The Air Force said Russia launched 465 drones as well as 32 cruise and ballistic missiles against Ukraine overnight. Air defences reportedly brought down 405 Russian drones and 15 missiles. Russia was said to have deployed Iskander-M, or the North Korean variant, the KN-23 ballistic missile. Iskander-K cruise missiles and the Kh-59 and 69 versions of other aerial missiles, as well as hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. President Zelensky said Moscow was targeting everything that sustains normal life, everything the Russians want to deprive us of. Now, our friend of the pod, Fabrice Deprez, who's a writer for Le Croix and Financial Times, he's based in Kyiv, lives in Kyiv. He said last night's strikes on Kyiv and other cities come 3 years to the day after Russia began its first winter strike campaign on energy infrastructure. He said a missile strike on October the 10th, 2022 caused a brief power outage in Kyiv, and 7 days later, Russia would launch Jade drones for the first time. Now, these attacks come after President Zelensky, speaking yesterday to AFP, said Russia's task is to create chaos and apply psychological pressure on the population through strikes on energy facilities and railways. We do know Russia has been intensifying its strikes on power plants and energy facilities in recent weeks. You'll remember last Friday, Russia launched about 100 drones and missiles at facilities in the Kharkiv and Poltava regions in what was then described as the most massive assault on Ukrainian energy infrastructure since the start of the full-scale invasion, according to Naftogaz, Ukraine's state-owned energy company. Now, as we said yesterday, Bloomberg were reporting those strikes had destroyed approximately 60% of Ukraine's natural gas production capability. Very serious. The damage means Ukraine will have to spend around €2 billion on fuel imports to ensure normal services across the country through this winter. Kyiv, we know, has appealed to G7 countries for financial support to repair its energy infrastructure and import fuel, as well as more air defence systems. Now, elsewhere, Ivan Fedorov, who's the governor of Zaporizhia region, confirmed that a 7-year-old boy had been killed in Russian strikes there. He said doctors fought for the child's life until the very end, but the injuries proved too severe. That city was first attacked with drones around 2 a.m., one of which struck a residential building, starting a large fire there. And ballistic missiles then targeted the region around 5 a.m., leading to further explosions across the city. Attacks across the country overlapped with a visit by Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski to Lviv Oblast in the west of Ukraine. Now, that area wasn't hit this morning, but was very heavily attacked last Sunday, you'll remember. Mr. Sikorski visited the site of that attack that we reported on earlier in the week in Lapaivka, that's a village just on the outskirts of Lviv, where 4 family members, including a 15-year-old girl, were killed. Mr. Sikorski laid flowers at the site. Elsewhere in Ukraine, there are reports that Russia has blown up an ammonia pipeline near Rusin Yar in Donetsk region, trying to slow down the movement of Ukrainian forces there. It's not the first time that Russia has violated a convention banning attacks on chemical plants and storages or nuclear power plants and water reservoir dams. Look at what's happening at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, look at the Kakhovka dam, as well as the other ammonia plants that we've been reporting on over the years. Now, a couple more from me into Russia. And as I pointed out the other day, rather strangely but helpfully, TASS, the Kremlin-affiliated state broadcaster, is continuing its little box of Ukrainian strikes. So today's in brief, Ukrainian drone attacks caused fires at energy facilities in southern Russia. We're told that Russian MOD said they'd shot down 19 Ukrainian drones across a number of Russian regions last night. TASS says that drones were sighted over Volgograd, Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, Voronezh, Oryol and Saratov regions, and there were temporary restrictions on flights at the airports in Saratov, Volgograd and Samara. Now, they're all hundreds of kilometres east of Ukraine. So again, continuing that long-range campaign by Ukraine. Elsewhere, German defence giant Rheinmetall said they're going to supply Ukraine with additional Skyranger 35 air defence systems based on a contract with an unnamed EU country. The company announced this earlier today. Now, that system, as an air defence system, can be mounted on the hull of Leopard 1 tanks, said to have a range of 4 kilometres and works well with the Oerlikon revolver gun Mark III. So it basically sits on top of the hull. The hull provides mobility and protection, and then the gun is a modern variant, basically, of an air defence gun, the Gepard. Now, this contract, worth, we are told, hundreds of millions, is financed by an EU member state using the proceeds from frozen Russian assets, the company said. They didn't name the country. They didn't name the mechanism either by which they've been able to get money from those frozen assets. We're told production and integration will be carried out by Rheinmetall Italia in Rome. The company didn't say how many systems are going to be delivered to Ukraine, but Rheinmetall's chief exec Armin Papage said, "We are grateful for the trust Ukraine has placed in us. We also thank the EU state for its support, which underscores our continued efforts to support Ukraine." Last one for me, Francis. The British Ministry of Defence says that a special blessing ceremony has taken place at the Catholic Memorial Cathedral in Aldershot in Hampshire, here in southern England. They say an icon arrived from Ukraine symbolising our solidarity with Ukrainians. So the icon, this is a sacred image, usually a painting that conveys spiritual meaning. This icon was carried out of Ukraine by an unnamed member of the Ukrainian military. It's the first ever icon of Our Lady of Victories and has been installed and blessed earlier this week at the Catholic Military Cathedral, bringing together Ukrainian and British communities. The sacred artwork was commissioned by the Catholic Military Association with support from Catholic Charities Aid to the Church in Need and the Catenian Association, created, we are told, using centuries-old techniques in a Lviv studio. Bishop Paul Mason said, "For the people of Ukraine, their faith is really important to them, and for them to know that we are united with them, not just militarily and financially, but also in prayer. This icon signifies that, which I think that is a very important piece for the whole thing." Captain Francis Osborne, who's the chairman of the Catholic Military Association, said, "We wanted something permanent as a foundation that our members could look to for solace and encouragement. An icon is a really ancient way of showing faith. Its beauty speaks right to the soul. It means a tremendous amount that it has got a home in Aldershot and that it will be seen by a lot of people and they can get benefit from it." We'll put a link in the episode notes to this article from the British MOD. And just on episode notes, just to finally finish, Francis, just on episode notes, many people have asked, most recently Kate, thanks for writing in. Kate asked, how do I find the show notes to the podcast? I can't find them on the Telegraph website or when I Google them. Okay, when we talk about episode notes, show notes and what have you, you'll find them in the episode descriptions on all major podcast platforms, so Apple, Spotify, YouTube. So not on our website yet, we are trying to change that, but on those other platforms, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, if you listen to us there, you can scroll down, you'll see all the episode notes that we put all the links to articles and guest contributors. That's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. The major story in foreign affairs today is, of course, the ceasefire in Gaza and the first stage of Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And I think given its far-reaching implications, it's worth our reflecting on what that means for the war in Ukraine. As we've discussed before, it's no secret that world leaders and foreign officials only have a limited amount of diplomatic oxygen at any one time. And few could argue that ever since October 7th, 2 years ago, there have been extended periods where Kyiv's struggle has been seen as less of a priority for certain nations as they prioritise instead the Middle East. So if the ceasefire holds, then might we expect Ukraine to become the foremost issue on the international stage once again? Given its importance, I think that's entirely possible. Another reason for believing so is that Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to peace missions, of course, including in the Middle East and Europe, may now have more time on his hands and return to Ukraine negotiations with renewed purpose. Already, President Trump has been saying he wants to step up the pressure for a Ukraine deal after yesterday. And yet, in the past couple of hours, the Nobel Prize Committee has announced that Trump has not won the peace prize he craves. Instead, it's gone to Maria Corina Machado of Venezuela for her work to achieve a peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy. There are question marks about whether Trump's peace drives in relation to Ukraine and especially the Middle East were designed to achieve successes before the prize was announced. Now it has been, and he's not won. Will his focus shift elsewhere? Now, just as a side note, I can't resist sharing a meme that's doing the rounds on social media this morning, mimicking the official Nobel Prize announcements. It announces General Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, of course, as the Nobel Prize winner in ecology for 2025, awarded for reducing fossil fuel production in Russia. Very good, whoever came up with that one. Now that brings me neatly onto our next topic, the Russian economy. A fascinating story in Reuters corroborates recent analysis about the damage being wrought. As they write, from railways and automobiles to metals, coal, diamonds and cement, some of Russia's biggest industrial companies are putting employees on furlough or cutting staff as the war economy slows, domestic demand stalls and exports dry up. We identified 6 companies in Russia's mining and transport sectors, many of them industrial titans, that have cut their working week in an attempt to reduce wage bills without raising unemployment. Chemros, Russia's biggest cement maker, has moved to a 4-day week until the end of the year to preserve staff amid a sharp downturn in the construction industry and a rise in imports. The company has 13,000 employees and 18 plants across Russia. The push to reduce wage bills shows the toll the conflict in Ukraine and Western sanctions are taking on corporate Russia and on the workers of its heavy industry plants, many of which were founded during Stalin's industrialization in the 1930s. So that's Reuters there, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Given the interconnected economies of Russia and its allies, it's worth remembering the impact this will have elsewhere too. We should take note of the fact that Serbia's main oil firm NIS, majority owned by Russia's Gazprom, is now fully under US sanctions after Washington's waivers expired. That matters a great deal to that country. Indeed, our world economy editor, Ambrose Evans-Pritchard, has written a deep dive into the present situation, complete with data and graphs, which we'll also link to. He mentions in that piece a hypothesis we've discussed before, namely the talk in security circles that Putin has reached a working deal with Xi, that Russia wears down NATO with aerial violations and cyber strikes seeking to sow division, while China stops the Russian economy from collapsing and commits to staying the course. Beijing, of course, wants to keep Russia in the war in order to stop the US turning its full attention to them. It's an important point which compels us to ask just how impactful the economic front is if China is truly all in. But that is an open question. Now, relevant to this is a decision by Beijing in the last 48 hours or so, as reported by the Financial Times, to unveil sweeping export controls on rare earths and related technologies as it boosts its leverage over critical minerals ahead of that meeting this month between Trump and Xi. To quote the FT, under the new Commerce Ministry rules, foreign companies will need Beijing's approval to export magnets that contain even trace amounts of China-sourced rare earth materials or that were produced under the country's extraction methods, refining or magnet-making technology. The restriction will, for the first time, create a Chinese version of the US Foreign Direct Product Rule, a measure Washington has used to block semiconductor-related exports to China from third countries. A White House official said Beijing's move appears to be an effort to exert control over the entire world's technology supply chains. China controls about 70% of rare earth mining, 90% of separation and processing, and 93% of magnet manufacturing. Now, the challenge for Kyiv and its allies remains that for many months, Washington's official policy assumed China and Russia could be prized apart, even though many would argue, as we have, their partnership is already too entrenched and mutually advantageous to undo. No doubt underscoring the way China is apparently benefiting from current White House policy will be the priority for the senior Ukrainian delegation arriving in Washington next week, led by Prime Minister Svyrydenko and head of Zelensky's office, Andriy Yermak. The formal topics apparently include air defence, energy and sanction steps, as well as the negotiation track. The issue of frozen assets will also be discussed, we understand. Now, going into that, Zelensky's written today that in a climate where even Hamas can negotiate, it's time for Russia to be compelled to do so. He goes on, I believe Trump wants us at the negotiating table, and we support this track. I believe our meeting, combined with the actual facts, has given him a broader understanding that the Russians are selling him something they are not capable of delivering. What's particularly important is that following our meeting, a dialogue is continuing at various levels. Everyone notes that despite the cold weather outside, our relations remain warm at various levels. Now that may be so, but just to extend the metaphor as we trespass into autumn, some would argue that thawing is going too far in certain countries in relation to Moscow. Earlier this week, I noted there are significant efforts underway within the EU to pass more robust legislation. However, Austria has now joined Belgium in creating complications. According to diplomats, Vienna informed the EU today that it will not support the bloc's latest sanctions package against Russia unless some Russian assets are unfrozen to compensate Austria's Raiffeisen, apologies if I've mispronounced that, bank for penalties imposed by Moscow. Other EU governments have rejected the proposal, arguing it would legitimise Russian court rulings that have retaliated against EU sanctions by ordering the confiscation of Western assets. They also fear it could set a dangerous precedent, encouraging other oligarchs to pursue similar claims. So, no breakthroughs yet in relation to the EU and sanctions packages and further legislation. An icy wind still blows from the east. But let's turn now to our fortnightly segment dedicated to the occupied territories with Dr. Jade McGlynn. Jade, welcome back. Always a pleasure. In Tuesday's episode, we played an interview I did in Frankfurt with Dr. Thomas Clausen, in which, among other topics, we spoke about the divergent ways in which Western countries and the Soviet authorities approached reconstruction after World War II. And appropriately, that's a subject I know you want to focus on today in relation to Russia's architecture of erasure in the occupied territories, before giving us, of course, the latest updates on the resistance. So over to you, Jade.
Yes, thank you. A fortuitous coincidence. When you read Russian occupation channels in the occupied territories, whether it's the localized ones that are supposed to be a little bit more on the ground or whether it's the official ones, you see a lot of talk about rebuilding. Russia is rebuilding what they call the new territories. But when you actually look into what this rebuilding means, it looks much more like a deliberate process of demolition, replacement, and then a sort of re-symbolization that's about urban planning, but Russian identity politics as well. So, for example, in September in Mariupol, we saw a big plan for, we call it mortgage development. And a lot of this information comes from sources around Realna Gazeta, which is a newspaper in evacuation from Luhansk. So the mortgage development of the historic part of Mariupol city. So there's going to be 51 high-rise blocks that are going to be placed instead of a low-rise Greek-Ukrainian buildings, very beautiful, that are obviously a core part of the city's past and its history. So clearing the way of historical buildings in order to replace them with high-rise blocks that, like I said, are going to be mortgageable and therefore out of the reach of people who are actually from Mariupol. People were not happy about this in Mariupol. In fact, there were public hearings that I think, could we say they were held? Probably we should say they were staged to try to calm people down with promises of providing other housing, the people who are going to be displaced. But there's not any trust, understandably, that that's going to happen. We also see that the redevelopment relies on a number of bureaucratic mechanisms. So we've spoken before on the podcast, and I know the pod has covered it separately as well, the process that the occupiers do to identify and register so-called ownerless property. This activity has become even more tense recently. So, for example, in Mariupol, there was an increase in 300 apartments just in September. So it appears that they have a quota and they have to identify 100 ownerless apartments per week to show work and also to meet a quota that I imagine is very much based in how the Russians use the occupied territories, which is, yes, for military purposes, but also as new resources, especially, and that's always been the case, as the elites are always very greedy and they're very hungry for new resources. Once a flats or the apartments are classified as ownerless, then they can be reassigned to officials, to soldiers' families, to developers, to your mates, to somebody you owe a favour, to somebody who paid you a bribe and you want to pay it off. So it's part of, I suppose, the informal economy, which seems to be pretty much the only economy actually working in the occupied territories. So we can use one example. So there were 10 apartments in a building on Metallurgov Avenue. They were nationalised, identified as ownerless, and then nationalised through that procedure. And then they were actually provided as compensation to the families who had been dispossessed either because of Russian bombing or because they'd been moved out. However, that building with these 10 apartments had at least 200 nationalised apartments. So there is some compensation, but it's very small and it's very much an afterthought. So anybody who thinks that this process is about making new buildings in order to house the high number of homeless people in Mariupol would be sadly mistaken, based on these statistics, which show that it's about 5%. And that's what we know of. That's what they're choosing to show. So we always have to be careful, even with that meager generosity. In Donetsk and other places, the numbers are much higher. According to the Russian Deputy Prime Minister, Marat Khusnulin, they say that nearly 5 million units have been inventoried, with hundreds of thousands of that housing or buildings classified as ownerless. So we're seeing like a systemic redistribution of property rights and, of course, integration of the areas into the Russian legal and administrative framework, which is in order to rob people. So you have this mixture of both greed and taking over buildings, and then at the same time that type of symbolic erasure. So all of the Ukrainian themed murals, even if the theme is not overt, they've all been painted over in cities like Mariupol and other cities. Instead, the murals are now Russian tricolors, propaganda about friendship with Russian cities, depictions of so-called heroes, also known as war criminals in the Western world, of the special military operation. Every single surface has to speak to an imagined Russian history of these areas. And the more symbolic the role of the building in Ukraine, and particularly during the war, the more likely it is to be repurposed. So if we think about Azovstal, the steelworks, which we all rightly associate with incredible Ukrainian courage and heroism and resistance, in the Russian planning documents that Realna Hasyata has access to, it's apparently supposed to become a theme park. And if you can think of something more ghoulish than that, even on this horrible day after these huge attacks on Kyiv and Zaporizhia and Dnipro, I'd be impressed, to be honest with you, Francis.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking to there, Jade, is the fact that they're not only erasing examples of history or previous Ukrainian history, but this would be the history of the future. This sort of site would be, as you say, a place of immense historical importance for a modern-day Ukraine, given the resistance that took place during the early phase of the war. And so it's almost a getting ahead of history, as it were, and putting your stamp on a place before it can even become a site of memory, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. And it always makes me think back to Putin's opening comments on that awful morning of the 24th February. Russia is fighting for its historical future. And I think it speaks to what you're saying and the spatial memory loss. So once these streets, these landmarks, these views are gone, then your collective memory in the future will have to rely solely on archives. And then it becomes something much more abstract and much more theoretical, as well as, of course, the socio-psychological aspect, in the sense that it's about the spatial, the visual normalization, so that people don't just live the occupation. They're not just living under occupation and all of its methods, but you feel it materially, like you live it, you're habituated within it, whether or not it's a mural, whether or not it's a street that was there for hundreds of years, but perhaps was renovated, but broadly in that form, and is destroyed to make way for, let's be honest, I haven't seen the exact building plans, but I'm going to go out on a limb and bet that they're pretty like garish and ugly, kind of massive tower apartment blocks that will be pretty much for collaborators and for Russian soldiers and Russian officials.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jade, for talking us through that issue that, again, gets often sidelined because of other things that we're compelled to talk about day to day. But where are we then on perhaps the latest resistance activities? I understand that it's been a trickier fortnight than in some recent months.
Yes, it has. And in a way, we've been coming to that. And I also want to start by making an apology, or at least an update. I need to listen back to the podcast to exactly what I said. Last time when I spoke on the pod, there were strikes on forests in Crimea. And I spoke about the fact that there were, strong rumours that Vladimir Saldo, so the occupation head of the occupied part of Kherson, was in those, and he was not. So I just wanted to update that those were rumours that proved to not be true, and to apologise if I contributed to spreading anything that wasn't true. And to come on to that point, we've really been struggling over, it's been an increasing issue, and sometimes it's more than others. And Ilya and I often have conversations, in the evening of, oh, look, there's a new resistance movement. This seems to be incredibly efficient, given his telegram has existed for all of 5 minutes. And oftentimes what we think we're seeing is not the Ukrainians trying to make stuff up, but actually the FSB or others trying to put out a kind of totally not credible resistance movement to further destroy trust in pro-Ukrainian segments of the population in the resistance movement, or indeed to flush people out who might be supportive of them. So that's more what we worry about. So we don't include those movements for obvious reasons. But since this is a murky area, we can't prove what our conclusions are on those new accounts. And we're not making any claims that that is the case. We just have a general intuition from looking and reading through these things that something is not right here. And whatever it might be, we don't want to include it. So just, I suppose, a little bit of insight into a not especially scientific methodology, but if we wanted to make it scientific, I can say it's digital ethnography and we're immersed within the digital environment. But very broadly, we read a lot of this stuff. We're really immersed in it and we just get a sense when something is not right for various reasons. Some of the events I'm going to talk about today are across the sources that we track. There were 16 confirmed operations in the last couple of weeks, and occupied Zaporizhia Oblast, parts of Zaporizhia Oblast were the most active area. But in quite a few of them, we weren't able to completely confirm. And normally we only like to include things that we can confirm through various ways. So I just want to, in particular, draw attention to some of the claims of anti-Smersh and a few of Atesh. We were not able to confirm these. So I'm going to include them, but I'm just going to stress that we could not find separate information, and just a good reminder to always be careful. So in Zaporizhia, for example, we saw Atesh both on the 25th and on the 30th of September and on the 6th and 8th of October, claiming that they had burned military fuel trucks and other kind of logistics hits, essentially to reduce inside a Russian unit that's stationed near Berdyansk. Atesh sources apparently within the 108th Air Assault Regiment also gave coordinates for a communications and command vehicle, enabling a strike that destroyed it. We can see that that was destroyed. Obviously, we can't confirm that the sources were within the 108th Air Assault Regiment because, much to the disappointment of everybody, I have to be honest, I do not have sources within the 108th Air Assault Regiment of the Russian Federation. Other elements include, though, on the 6th of October, which I mentioned, another Atesh agent destroyed a railway relay cabinet near Verkhny Tokhmak, which blocked military cargo movement between Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. So Tokhmak is the city, if you remember, or the town that people hoped could be liberated as a minimum should the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 have been successful. So it's very close to the front line. And then on the 8th of October, a radio van used as a mobile command post was destroyed. That was actually through a precision strike. So from outside the occupied territories, Atesh claimed that it was their eyes that provided the coordinates. So quite a few of Atesh's ones we can see that has been destroyed. The story behind how it was destroyed is harder. On the 28th of September, Anti-Smersh said that it had killed 4 occupiers in Melitopol and very much stressed that this was punishment for abuses and used it again to call for tips. This is one of those ones where there's some information that something has happened, but I would treat this one with caution. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm just saying that we have to treat it with caution, especially since there is this focus on calls for other people to provide coordinates. There may be a sense of we need to have something big or to make something that genuinely happened look a bit bigger than it was in order to get recruitment. So that's what's been happening in the occupied part of Zaporizhia. In the occupied part of Kherson, we also saw Anti-Smersh claiming that they'd burned the car of Saudo's security guard in Henichesk. Other sources that I've spoken to in Kherson have poured cold water on this, but it's been doing the rounds. So I just wanted to at least address it, though we've not included it in this particular list of the 16. Other actions was quite similar. So again, filming, geolocating Russian equipment and where possible doing it on the ground, but much more often sending the information to Ukrainian forces who then can knock it out. Perhaps the most famous incident would have been on the 1st of October when there was a Baba Yaga, who's like this evil witch who lives in a house in the forest. The house is on chicken legs. She's terrifying, to be honest. If I had to make a drone, I would call it Baba Yaga as well. So well done, Ukraine. And this attack resulted in the hospitalization and then subsequent death of the collaborator Vladimir Leontiev, who was the Russian Russian-installed head of the occupation administration of Nova Kakhovka, of the famous, not infamous, dam destruction by Russia in Kherson region. And this was a man who was not a kind of everyday collaborator, just doing it to survive. In March 2022, he ordered the Russian armed forces to kidnap and torture the mayor of Berislav, Alexander Shapovalov, and he had been sentenced in absentia by Ukrainian authorities. He was also tried in absentia for the abduction of the journalist Oleg Baturin from Kakhovka, of the abduction of the mayor of Tavrisk, Nikolai Rizak, and of the abduction of the secretary of Novokakhovka City Council, Dmitry Vasilyev. The prisoners were beaten, brutally tortured, handcuffed for long periods of time, deprived of water and food, and subjected to intense psychological pressure. And the secretary of Novokakhovka City Council, though he was released, 9 months after his release, he died of the injuries that he sustained. Beyond that, I suppose, quite show-stopping incident, there were a couple of incidents in occupied parts of Donetsk and now essentially fully occupied Luhansk region, but they're very similar rail sabotages, again designed to slow the flows of ammunition, equipment and personnel, pretty much all of which come through northern Donetsk region and then go down south to Mariupol and then go across into Zaporizhia or sometimes into then Kherson.
Well, thank you as ever, Jade, for those updates on resistance activities and, of course, to your researcher, Ilya, for all of his efforts. Until next time.
Thank you, and thank you for having us on.
And now, a short interview with Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of United States Army Europe, which I recorded in Germany a few weeks ago. Well, Ben Hodges, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to speak to you again. We've caught up several times since we had you at Telegraph Towers about a year and a half ago, but it's a golden opportunity to have a catch-up here at the Land Euro conference in Wiesbaden. I've heard quite a lot of, perhaps optimism is the wrong word, but just a general sense of, look, we're not going anywhere from the American point of view, and people have emphasised on mic and off mic that this is a very, very complicated thing. If we were to be asked to withdraw, you can't just do it overnight. But you're someone who's got more expertise on this than the vast, vast majority of people here, let alone in the world at large. What's your assessment of how dangerous a moment this is in the American context of withdrawal?
Well, the biggest danger is if the Russians perceive that the United States is perhaps not 100% committed to fulfilling its NATO obligations, or that we would somehow turn our back on our European allies, or that we don't really care what happens to Ukraine.
So you don't think that the NATO summit last will have got rid of those fears?
I would say I personally feel a little bit more confident that at least the president said all the right things. The problem is he has so often done something or said something different almost the day after that you can't be as confident as maybe one traditionally would be. And of course, there's no doubt that European allies need to have done more anyway themselves. You certainly get the sense that that's happening in many places. But the danger is if there's a misperception in the Kremlin that, well, maybe we could do this because the U.S. doesn't really want to. So that's the biggest danger. Now, I feel pretty confident that what the U.S. has in Europe now is going to stay at about this level at least through the end of the year. There's not anything that's here that's desperately needed over in the Pacific. You're not going to take the Stryker Regiment, or the only Patriot Battalion we have and send it to the Philippines or Guam or something like that. But I do anticipate that there is going to be budget cuts that affect big Army, which means there will be less money available for paying for the rotational forces. And all of the armor here, that's all rotational. So if that starts getting reduced and you have less armored capability, less attack aviation, that starts to become a worry. And I think that's very possible over the next couple of years. But it would be due to budget cuts of big Army. The Department of Defense sees, of course, the Indo-Pacific region as predominantly maritime and air domain, Europe as land domain, and so they're going to take from Army to give to Air Force and Navy.
Let's move away from the European theatre then and into Ukraine. What's your military strategic assessment of where we are in the present moment?
So I think unless something significantly new happens externally, either on the Russian side or on the Ukrainian side, externally, then probably it looks a lot like it does now a year from now. Russians just don't have the ability to overwhelm and break through or overrun Ukrainian defenses. I mean, it's terrible, especially if you're a civilian living in Kharkiv or Kherson or where you're getting hit every night. That's going to continue, but that's not decisive. That doesn't change the direction of the war. It just kills innocent people. On the other hand, unless something significant happens where we, the West, commit to helping Ukraine win and give them what they need without restrictions, then they also don't have the ability to dramatically change the situation around. Stalemate doesn't sound right because there is movement all along this line, but it's nothing that's decisive. So what would be an example of something external? You know, if we got serious about defeating Russia or getting them to negotiation, it's only going to happen economically. And I mean shutting down their ability to export oil to China and India. And that means this stinking shadow fleet, that's got to stop or be disrupted somehow. And you can do that using legal means. Use the 300 billion frozen assets and manipulating the market. These are all things that could wreck Russia's ability to export and make money off of their oil. If you did that, that would change behavior. They don't care how many casualties they have, even if it's probably even closer to 2 million than it is 1 million. I think that's the kind of thing that could change the dynamic.
Do you think then the secondary 100% tariffs that Trump's threatening, do you not think that would be enough, or is it that you just don't think they're really going to be enacted?
Oh, he's not going to ever do it. I mean, first of all, thanks for reminding me of that. You remember there was this bill that had like over 80 senators, strong bipartisan
the Graham-Blumenthal bill.
Yes, that was going to put 500% tariffs on anybody that bought Russian oil. I mean, that would be bone-crushing. The president, when he's there with Ruda and they make the announcements, he doesn't even allude to it. It just swats it away and says secondary of 100%. Now, that's not inconsequential, but you have this other thing going with huge bipartisan support, and it seems disjointed, actually, and I have zero confidence. And, of course, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Thune, immediately parked a big, strong one because the Republicans in the Senate are not going to challenge the president, unfortunately. I always hoped that the president would realize that Putin was playing him along, mocking him, as they did the other day, shows no respect for this administration. So I hope one day President Trump would get pissed off like, God damn it, you know, but he never will. And the Russians see that. And so probably at day 48, they'll make some offer to, okay, hey, can we, you know, it's not going to happen.
I think your skepticism is echoed by many of our listeners, and I should say myself included. Given all of that, then, what would be your message to European leaders? Because many of them do still seem to be thinking that this all, at least in the short term, rests upon decisions made in the White House, and the priority has to be keeping Mr. Trump on board.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's better for all of us, including the United States, if the United States stays fully engaged in Europe, in the alliance, and also helps Ukraine defeat Russia.
It could be worse.
Yeah, it could be. And it's in our strategic interest that Europe is prosperous, which means it has to be stable and secure, which means you can't have millions of Ukrainian refugees trying to get away from Russian forces. And also the disruption of energy and food shipments out of Ukraine, that affects prices for all of us. And then, of course, the Chinese are watching to see, are we really serious about this sovereignty thing? And do we have the will to make hard decisions? Right now, I think the Chinese are not too impressed. And so it matters if the U.S. links together all these threats. Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. They look at this as one strategic issue, and you prioritize, you know, defeat Russia first, just the way Great Britain and the United States said we've got to defeat Nazi Germany first, so that we can then...
An enormously far-sighted decision, underappreciated, I think. I mean, wow, you know, you've just been attacked by, sorry, there's a historical tangent, but you've just been attacked by the Japanese, but you make the decision to go for Germany first. Extraordinary.
When there was zero interest in the United States to get involved in a European land war, yet President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were able to realize, okay, we can't lose Great Britain, or number one, or all the resources of the empire if we're going to defeat Japan, so we have to defeat Germany first. And then the president, when you had a clearly defined objective at a time when there was, I mean, think early 42 and then early 43, when they also made the decision, unconditional surrender, not a better negotiating position, unconditional surrender. at a time when there was zero reason for optimism. I mean, think January 43, where were we in the war? So real strategic foresight, but also courage. And then you got the American people on board, and we went from having the number 17 army in the world right behind Bulgaria to having 12 million women and men in uniform in the space of 3 years. So that's what's possible.
Yes.
So when I hear my European friends say, oh, you know, there's no way we can do this without the U.S., bullshit. When you add together the combined economies and industries and technological advantages and military capabilities of all of the EU plus UK plus Canada plus Norway, it dwarfs Russia. It's not even close. You know, what's missing, of course, is the political will.
It feels rude almost to say this to an American, but it just struck me reading this recently to a point of what you were just saying, that the American forces at Operation Torch in North Africa were not considered an overarching success.
Not at all.
And I think I'm right in saying that somebody described them as Britain's Italians, as in, like, you know, not, which is, I mean, really, with no disrespect to our Italian listeners either, I think it's important to underscore that, as you say, the boldness of the strategic decisions that were made in that period, it wasn't with the might of America as we know today behind it. It was a far-sightedness that came from a self-assurance, but it was not the easiest of decisions. There was no guarantee in 42, 43, and yet there's none of that far-sightedness and confidence today, is there?
Even in as late as 44, the war could still be lost in late 44. So I think probably my biggest frustration with both the Biden administration and the Trump administration when it comes to Ukraine is that neither president has said our objective is to X. You know, Biden's was, we're with you for as long as it takes, or we want to put you in a good negotiating position. That's not a strategic insight or end state. On the Trump administration, stop the killing. Okay, well, tell your friend Putin to leave. Okay, that's how you stop the killing. Or to get to negotiations, that's not an end state. The end state should be Russia lives inside its own borders the way everybody else does and doesn't attack their neighbors. Peace would be breaking out all over, certainly Europe. So how do we make them do that? And when you have a clearly defined end state, then you can develop and implement policy. But if you don't have an end state, you can't do policy.
Yeah. And there is just still, when you hear that phrase, for as long as it takes, to do what? To do what?
Yes, exactly. So I think, you know, whatever it takes is better than as long as it takes.
Ben, it's always a pleasure hearing your reflections on all of these subjects. Is there anything that we've not talked about that you would just want to impress upon people?
Well, you know, one of the most important duties of our civilian leaders is to speak to all of us as if we were adults and explain, hey, this is what's at stake here. Yes, it's going to be expensive. Yes, we would all rather spend more money on certain things. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a safe and secure environment, you can't do any of the other things. And yes, there are nations and people out there that hate us or do not wish us well. And so even UK is not safe from missile attacks, sabotage, assassination, all the different threats that are out there, not just to the island, but to everywhere else that you have interests. And it's hard for civilian leaders to say that sometimes, because if you say it, then you have to do something about it. And of course I know UK, just like every other country, is dealing with tough choices about NHS, infrastructure, migration issues. But without security, all of the other things are going to pale in terms of their significance.
And their cost if it all goes wrong.
This war in Ukraine is what failed deterrence looks like. If we had acted decisively, this is primarily U.S., but not only, after the Russians invaded Georgia, after they invaded Ukraine in 2014, after they violated the Budapest Memorandum, if U.S. and U.K., after they jumped over President Obama's red line in Syria, there's multiple times where we, the West, could have acted decisively against Russia, and we wouldn't be talking about Ukraine today, certainly not a war.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your time.
Thanks for the privilege.
let's go to our final thoughts. Just a very quick one from me. Several of you wrote in asking where you could watch the clip of Dom and me on Russian TV after they took umbrage at our documentary in Odessa. I've shared a clip on X, which will be in the show notes. It's a good thing I've got a thick skin, because the voice actor they used to play me is, well, something else. It's given my friends no end of amusement. But Dom, where do you want to leave listeners at the end of this week?
Thanks, Francis. Well, and another bit of self-promotion, just to say we're trying to arrange more tickets for the October the 22nd event here in London, central London, the Honourable Artillery Company. We're going to be doing a panel event with two very special guests, Orysia Lutsevich, who heads up the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, and also retired General Sir Richard Barrons, who was one of the authors of Britain's recent Strategic Defence Review. So the five of us will be on the stage, those two, Adderley moderating, me and him over there. So do come and join us. I think we've actually sold all this current tranche of tickets, but we're trying to get some more, so we'll put the link in the episode notes. Do have a look at that. If you wish to, please do come along. It'd be great to see you. Great to have a drink afterwards and a chat. But yeah, we'll try and find some more.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.